Hey! What's your name? My name's... Someone need a hug. I just wanted a hug!
Hello everybody, this is the Eliminator speaking. And yup, it's finally that time. Time to talk about the movie that kicked off this whole retrospective to begin with. And really convinced me to start talking about the MCU, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. If it wasn't obvious, I've been really excited to talk about this one. And what better time to do that than on the 10th anniversary of the first film. So, without wasting any time, let's get into this. While there's definitely a bit I'd like to talk about in regards to the background of this movie, I want to save that for a later video down the line. So, let's go straight to the characters in this movie, starting of course with Star-Lord. Now, unlike the second movie, Guardians 3 actually takes place a while after the first one, and in that time the team has done a lot of things. For example, they met Gamora's father, participated in the world's worst social experiment, went on vacation with Thor, and celebrated the first Christmas in probably a good long while. Anyways, getting back on topic, Star-Lord isn't in the best place at the start of this movie, as he's coping with the loss of Gamora. A good example of this being his introduction in this movie. We see him getting drunk, and when he tries to stand up, he's stumbling all over the place. However, what I really like is how the Guardians don't seem to be fazed by this at all, and just carry him back to his room, implying that he does this almost every time they're not on a mission. More importantly, it factors into Star-Lord's arc about trying to move on from the past, given that Gamora, the version of her from the past that came back in Avengers Endgame and everything, is here in the movie, and is a different character from the one that he knew. If the movie didn't make it obvious, this version of Gamora is from before she met the Guardians. So, while she was trying to get out from under Thanos, she still had a lot of stuff to work through, and generally had a more abrasive personality. So, in this movie, she's with the Ravagers, and just so happens to be helping Star-Lord and the others, with his constant attempts to remind her of who she was, failing miserably. Though she is reminded of the value of family as she helps the Guardians to save Rocket. And with that, I'd say we're basically done with Gamora. And while there is more I'd like to say about Star-Lord,
I mustn't tell you any more, or I shall...
Actually, I do want to talk about that within this video, just at a later point. So, let's jump to Nebula. In the time since Guardians 2, Nebula has basically become an honorary member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, following the events of Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. While she has gotten away from Thanos, the influence he's had on her still lingers, as she's easily the most hard-edged member of the team. And unlike Gamora, the Guardians were never really able to crack through that hard shell she had. Nebula's arc throughout the movie, and a message throughout the film as a whole, is the idea of self-love. If you remember what I mentioned in the video on the second movie, you'll remember me mentioning how Nebula, during her time with Thanos, was always coming up short next to Gamora, and as a result, was basically whittled away at, having parts of her body replaced with machinery. As a result, she basically projects this insecurity of not measuring up onto the other Guardians, as while the Guardians are willing to blame each other for their own mistakes, Nebula is easily the harshest critic when it comes to that. Similar to the second movie, this reaches a boiling point when Mantis calls her out on it while Nebula is chastising her and Drax. And one thing that Mantis brings up is the fact that Drax is the only member of the team that doesn't hate himself. And a detail I love is that this is actually quite accurate. Despite failing to save his family from Ronin, and later failing to save the universe, Drax doesn't seem to really tear into himself a ton. Sure, he does things to honor the people he's lost in his life, but it's not like Star-Lord or Gamora where it haunts him in a way because he ran away or because he was taken away. He still mourns, but it doesn't consume him. At least not anymore. This aspect of Drax's character is exemplified best when he, Nebula, and Mantis all get trapped in the High Evolutionary's base. And when trying to communicate with some of the children that he has captured, Nebula winds up making them cry, whereas Drax is able to get them to do what they need, as he actually knows their language. And when Nebula asks how he knew the language, Drax simply responds with, "Why didn't you ask?" And I love how it causes Nebula to sort of reevaluate her approach. Like, even if it was only subconscious, the fact that she immediately assumed that no one else was smart enough to do the tasks at hand and highlights just how warped her view of others has become. On top of that, it's shown that while Nebula may be critical of them, she still does care about the Guardians, which of course is best exemplified when it's revealed that Rocket is still alive, with her arc then coming full circle when she and Drax decide to help take care of the children who were kidnapped by the High Evolutionary after bringing them back over to their base, giving them a better life in a less hostile environment. And with that, we've basically covered Nebula's arc, alongside Drax and partially Mantis. The reason I say Mantis partially is because I'm saving more of her stuff for the story section, but with Drax, unfortunately, this movie, like the second film, gives him less to do. Like, his biggest character moment is basically the interaction with Nebula and Mantis that I mentioned earlier. However, with them out of the way, it means we can really get to the meat of the characters section, that being Rocket and the High Evolutionary. In regards to the High Evolutionary, I already have a few words planned.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting. This is awful in every way. If I could kill it, I would. But I legally can't. But I've considered it.
Without a doubt, the best antagonist of the Guardians movies, and probably one of the best in the MCU. Basically, if you were to take Thanos' self-righteous crusade and give him next to no justification for it, you'd have this guy. And honestly, I'd say that's saying a lot, where Thanos actually had events and stuff to justify his rationality. Everything the High Evolutionary does is to satiate his own ego. And this is apparent just about every time he's on screen. He has to stand up on a stool when talking to the Queen of the Sovereign because she's taller than him, just so he can look down on her. When chastising Adam Warlock for failing to get Rocket, he feels the need to slam him around. Or the fact that he explodes at Rocket after Rocket points out the critical flaw in his design. In fact, every other interaction he has with someone is him screaming at them for their supposed incompetence, when really it's just them struggling to perform to a standard that he himself is unable to keep up with. Every other thing he says or does is basically to make himself feel bigger or better than someone else. Another example of this being when Star-Lord and Groot managed to get up into his base. He talks about how at one point he visited Earth, and in it he noticed all the bigotry and all the other problems that inspired him to create Counter-Earth. But the way he goes about it clearly is meant to say that he was the only one smart enough to do it, as he basically talks to Star-Lord and Groot like they're idiots. And when Star-Lord dismisses him completely, he just sends all the guards in to kill him, since there's no one to marvel at his genius. Similar to what I said about the Riddler in my video on the Batman, the High Evolutionary's thing is not that he's trying to actually prove that, he's trying to save humanity or anything, or save any species. He's simply trying to prove that he was the only one smart enough to do this. Like, he should be overjoyed that one of his creations is smart enough to point out the flaw in its own design, as well as the designs of others. But no, he gets mad, almost as if he's annoyed that he didn't come up with it. And that's the High Evolutionary's biggest issue. Rocket says that he didn't care about perfection, and that he just hated things the way they are. The reality of it is that he doesn't care about making the perfect species. He just wants the glory that will come with it. He likes the ring to it, and so he sets out to do it. He constantly raves about there being no god, and that being the reason why he stepped in, when let's be honest, the only gods that he'd really fit in with are the ones at Olympus, and even they get sick of him, despite him basically being the same as them. Though, unlike the Greek gods, he goes down pretty easily. You'd think a supreme being would be able to hold himself together in a fight like this, but it goes to show just how pathetic he actually is. But regardless of that, you can't deny that being around somebody like that constantly would have an effect on you, and Rocket is the best example of that. See, in the previous movies, it was always implied that some pretty messed up stuff had happened to Rocket in order for him to get to the place that he is. But even then, I don't think anyone expected Rocket's flashbacks to go into such gruesome detail about the things that happened to him. Though honestly, I feel that it really helps the movie's case because it really shows that what happened to Rocket was messed up, and that Rocket himself was messed up by it. In fact, it actually reminds me of another MCU movie that tried to do a similar thing, that being Black Widow. Unfortunately, Black Widow is pretty mediocre, and yes, I say that with the full knowledge of how easy it is to tear into the MCU post-2019. But getting back on topic, one of the things that this movie tries to do at the start is that they try to show us the main character's life before everything went wrong, and honestly, I'd say that Black Widow's beginning is really solid, but the only problem is that Natasha was never really given too much of a presence in the MCU outside of the Avengers movies. And on top of that, the movie never goes deep enough into what actually happened to her, and showing us how it shaped her as a person. Instead, it's all used in a quick montage in the beginning, with the only other time it being brought up in the movie, it's spoken word and it's being used as a gross out joke. Whereas Guardians 3 starts with a quick flashback near the beginning, but then, over the course of the movie, we see other flashbacks to Rocket's life while he is slowly dying. And it's here that we see how things really went for him. We see that while Rocket was tortured, he actually did try to make friends. And the fact that he actually tried to be happy makes it all the more tragic when that happiness is ripped away from him. Obviously, we know that none of these other experiments are going to survive, so the movie makes us dread the moment it happens. And, as hundreds of other YouTubers have already mentioned, this also informs a lot of Rocket's actions in the earlier movies. For example, Rocket constantly chastises Groot, calling him idiot and everything whenever he messes up, but notice that Rocket never left Groot's side or abandoned him at any point. Groot definitely sees Rocket as a friend, and Rocket secretly doesn't want to admit that he views Groot the same way, until it's too late. Or how Rocket hates it when people call him a raccoon, and on occasion refers to himself as a monster. That's because his creator always referred to him as an abomination. And, revisiting that first example, not only does Rocket see Groot as a friend, but he's also partially projecting his own insecurities about not being able to save his. Near the start of the movie, when the Guardians are seeing how Rocket was made, Nebula mentions that what he went through is worse than what Thanos did to her. And so, knowing that Rocket went through all that, but still was able to go through the first two movies as well as Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, really highlights his emotional resilience. And it also makes the moment where he's at death's door looking back on his entire life, only to go and reclaim his life for himself, and the story being all his own, feels genuinely impactful and triumphant. Also, like Nebula, Rocket's whole arc is about self-love, and him coming to terms with the fact that, while he may not be in his ideal form, he's still worthy of love, be it from himself or others. My only gripe with this is that Rocket is unconscious for most of the movie, and so he's not really able to interact with the other Guardians. Groot and Rocket have known each other for the longest out of all the members, yet we don't really get to see Groot having much of a personal reaction to everything happening. Like, we see Star-Lord screaming as Rocket seemingly flatlines while in the medbay, but we don't really get as much of a glimpse into Groot's reaction, even though he's right there with him. Personally, the one thing I would have done to change the scene is that I would have had Rocket be conscious throughout most of the movie, showing the Guardians where they need to go in order to get all this stuff done, or at the very least, the Guardians being given clues to it. And while they're off running around doing all the stuff they need, Rocket is thinking about the last moments of his life, as well as everything that happened to lead him up to that point. But otherwise, I feel like the movie actually handled him really well. And with that, we can finally move on to the supporting characters. And honestly, I don't have too much to say. With Adam Warlock, they mostly just use him as a gag character due to the fact that he was taken out of his pod early, and he's basically going through the whole Born Yesterday type story beats, but again in a more comedic sense. Then you have the Queen of the Sovereign, who is killed off about halfway through and isn't given all too much aside from what she was planning to do at the end of the second movie, which was get revenge on the Guardians. But honestly, she's not really that great as a secondary antagonist, given that she's already working alongside the High Evolutionary, whereas someone like Yondu was pursuing Star-Lord and the others for his own personal gain. And speaking of which, you have that one crewmate from the second movie who wasn't killed off, and his dynamic with Cosmo, the space dog, with him calling Cosmo a bad dog and Cosmo constantly trying to get him to take it back. But other than that, I'd say we're done with the characters. So, let's move on to the story. Now that we're done with the characters, let's take a look at the story for Guardians 3. As always, spoilers ahead for the movie. Of course though, if you're at this point, you've either seen it or just don't care. So, let's begin. In Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the Guardians are attacked at their base of operations while going about their everyday. In the ambush, Rocket is mortally wounded, and while looking for ways to save him, Star-Lord and the others learn that he was created by a man only known as the High Evolutionary. While tracking him back to his base, Star-Lord and the others learn that the High Evolutionary is a madman who is trying to create the perfect species, and that he believes Rocket is the key to all of it, hence the ambush. Now, the Guardians have to make sure their friend stays alive while keeping him out of the hands that made him. Now, something that I noticed about the Guardians movies over time is that they got more personal with each installment. Now, make no mistake, I don't mean that, the Guardians movies become more self-contained. they've always been self-contained, and you can say that about a lot of entries in the MCU. What I mean specifically is that the Guardians start to have more of a personal stake in each of the conflicts that they come across. As I've said multiple times now, the first movie is a pretty basic story that's really carried by the characters within it. And while the second movie does do more of its own thing, it does still fall into trappings that kind of hold it back in some way. But Guardians 3 shows us right from the jump that things are personal here, and throughout the movie, we're specifically shown how the High Evolutionary's actions affect Rocket. Yeah, he's experimenting on tons of other animals, but Rocket is specifically the one under threat throughout the movie, and seeing Star-Lord and the others go to hell and back just to save his life specifically makes it more impactful. It shows just how much they've grown as a family unit, and they even managed to save what is probably a planet's worth of children and animals in the process. But focusing on the former point, one thing I really love is how the stakes escalate more and more throughout the films. Rocket's death already serves as a ticking clock, but every time the Guardians show up in a new location, they run the risk of getting defeated and or killed. They aren't just jumping from place to place collecting the MacGuffins that they need to save Rocket. The Guardians almost always escape at the last minute, and it's always with a myriad of bruises. I was genuinely convinced that most of the time these characters were going to die, because I had been conditioned to think that, especially since this is basically the conclusion of the original team's story. And plus, Infinity War showed that these characters really aren't safe. Even if a new version is brought in to replace them, it'll still be drastically different. Yeah, Groot got revived, but that was only hinted at the very end of the movie, after he basically got destroyed protecting the other Guardians, and he wasn't brought back until after the villain was killed. And again, it was a different version of him. Like I said in my review of the first movie, these guys had some of the worst lives imaginable, and so to have them survive all these ordeals and get the happy ending they so desperately need feels just as, if not more satisfying than if they were killed off earlier in the story in more believable ways. Same with the way that the Guardians disband at the end of the movie. We watch these guys come together and over the course of various films, watch them go through trials and tribulations that really tested their bonds, and watch them come out stronger. And like most families, they eventually went their separate ways. And again, the ways they go feel very satisfying because of what we know about each of the characters. Drax gets another chance at making a family of his own after losing his original one. Mantis finally gets to live by herself and make her own decisions after years of being a subordinate to others. Nebula continues helping people out at HQ, but now she is truly happier after everything she's been through. Rocket becomes leader of the Guardians and is able to lead a new team with a new outlook on life. And Star-Lord finally gets to catch up with his biological family, the ones that aren't evil of course, after years of being apart, while also finding some amount of closure with Gamora. As a result, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies feel like one of the only MCU film series to really have a proper ending. On top of that, they still leave it open to the idea of new stories with these different characters. So, it's not like this is the last time we'll ever see anyone again. Now, while I do have more I would like to say about these characters and their stories, that pertains more to the film series as a whole, and that's its own video with its own tumultuous production. So, let's wrap things up. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments section. What did you like about Guardians 3? What didn't you like? And do you think that it's a worthy conclusion to the original set of films? Also, as a bonus question, tell me, how would you like the characters of Guardians to be used in later Marvel projects? As always, subscribe today to join the A-list, and have a great day. Bye!